The subject today is social democracy, European social democracy, which is the default position of the progressives throughout the world. It is the project that seems to have the greatest support throughout the world, even though it is clearly misunderstood. If the world had to vote to be a certain regime, it would probably vote to be Scandinavian social democracy. It is misunderstood in the following way. The world imagines that the end of it, the outcome, a social regime humanizing so-called capitalism through compensatory redistribution and redistributive social entitlements, was there at the beginning. In fact, if you take Sweden, for example, there were many decades in the 20th century of conflict between the Swedish state and the familial plutocracies, the plutocratic dynasties, which to this day continue to own much of Sweden. And this conflict for power and wealth ended in a compromise. By the compromise, the Swedish state required these family dynasties to relinquish much of their formal ownership, but to retain effective control through trust-like devices. The world sees only the final chapter and imagines they can have that final chapter without having the many decades of conflict that preceded it. Now, in my discussion today of social democracy, I want to proceed through 3 steps. In the first step, a characterization, a rudimentary characterization of what social democracy has been. In the second step, an account of what happened to it, how it evolved and changed and became what I'm going to label social liberalism. And in the third step, the future and the meaning of the evolution of this project. And of course, as always, interrupt me and I will also provoke your commentary. So first, the conception of social democracy, the definition of social democracy. You could see it as a compromise, a settlement. By the terms of these settlements, the social and ideological forces that threatened the established order of wealth and of power in Europe before and after the First World War renounced this threat. They gave up the threat. And in exchange for their abdication of the challenge to the established order of power and wealth, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to attenuate its inequalities through compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation, and to develop a well-financed welfare state that assured the citizens of a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed, as I observed in an earlier class, by the regressive taxation, the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the flat rate comprehensive value-added tax. That's the basic terms of the compromise. And to describe it in that way as a settlement or a compromise is already to suggest that it was never a system, a regime. It was never the enactment in history of a pre-existing systemic regime of the kind that Marx, for example, represented with his concept of capitalism, and more generally his concept of the modes of production. Now let me try to define social democracy by a second approximation, a second try, and the second try closer to history. In this second approximation, we can see social democracy unsentimentally and realistically as a combination of three sets of arrangements. Institutional arrangements. The first set of arrangements was the defense of the small against the big, of small business against big business, of workers with relatively secure jobs in the so-called primary sector of the labor market against workers in unstable employment, and of the incumbents in control of corporate entities as against all the challengers. The little against the big, little business against big business, incumbent business against challenging business, and the predominant interest against all who would overturn them. There were arrangements with a heavy bias in favor of the status quo, of the established controllers of assets and power in the society and in the economy. The second set of arrangements that historically characterized social democracy were arrangements sometimes described as social contracts or social compacts. The essence of these arrangements is that they represented an agreement brokered by the state between big business and organized labor to predetermine the distribution of the costs and benefits of different macroeconomic policies, different ways of shaping growth, saving, employment, and interest in the economy. And the idea was that if there could be consensus, a consensual growth path, a consensual path of macroeconomic stability, it would be more efficient. And the cost of conflict would be avoided. Of course, a corollary of this second set of arrangements is that the major interest, big business as against petty business, and organized labor as against disorganized labor or precarious labor, were favored at the table. They were the ones that were directly represented in the negotiation. The third set of institutional arrangements that define social democracy was the development and funding of a high level of social entitlements. As I mentioned before and will mention again, paradoxically funded by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive VAT, the value-added tax. And we went over this in another context in a previous class. The paradoxes of contemporary fiscal experience. Remember, I pointed out to you, on paper, among the rich industrial democracies, the one that has the most progressive tax system is the most unequal, the United States, because it gives pride of place to the progressive taxation of personal income. By comparison, I said, the European social democracies, which are far more egalitarian in the aggregate outcome of the budget, rely heavily on the most regressive tax, the VAT. And then I said, what's the simple explanation of this apparent paradox? The simple explanation is that with respect to the budget, taking into account simultaneously the revenue-raising side and the spending side, what matters overwhelmingly is the aggregate tax take and how it is spent, rather than the relatively progressive profile of taxation. So the VAT takes a constant amount out of the value of the transfer of every input into an output. It's like a little machine, taking a neutral amount at all steps and stages of the whole process of production and circulation of goods and services. And because it is completely neutral, it can maximize the tax take while minimizing the trauma to the established economic arrangements and to the incentives to save, invest, and employ. That is the simple explanation for the apparent paradox. And that explanation lies at the heart of this third arrangement, which I described as having composed the essence of historical social democracy. So this second way of describing social democracy, by reference to the three arrangements that built it up, tears the veil of piety from it and presents it in what I call an unsentimental direction, an unsentimental way. And to this day, you could say that the greatest historical achievement of social democracy and of its successor, social liberalism, is to have attained a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities, in their health, in their education, and in their physical integrity. Despite all the criticisms I'm going to level against it, this was a very great accomplishment. And it was so great an accomplishment in economic and social terms that has never been reversed in any European country that witnessed the development of a social democracy. So subsequent right-wing parties that came into power, having criticized the fiscal burden of maintaining this structure never successfully tried to undo it. And it has become a premise of European politics, under social democracy and social liberalism. So that includes, for example, Mrs. Thatcher in England, or the right-wing governments in Germany. Now let me stop right there and ask whether someone would like to ask a question or make a comment about this characterization of social democracy. The social democracy described in the first way I described it, the first approximation, helps explain the characteristic posture of the progressives in the contemporary world. I said in the first class, they appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. And their whole attitude in ideological debate and political conflict is that they're the humanizers. At some level, they don't need to have a program, because if you ask them what's their program, they can say, our program is your program, you the conservative with a human face. The progressive position is the humanization of the inevitable. Now let me stop and ask whether someone would like to comment on this first set of propositions. Yes? No?
I'd like to make one brief comment. So I'm from Denmark.
Speak loud and use your mic.
Sorry about that. So I'm from Denmark, supposedly one of these prototypical
Yes.
social democracies. My question goes, or comment, reflection, goes more on sort of the antecedents of social democracy. Because you said comparatively, many of these social democracies are quite homogenous.
Many of them, you have to speak a little louder. Just speak louder, shout.
Many of the social democracies in Europe are quite homogenous in terms of their population.
Yes.
And when people have done comparative studies with the United States, the only factor that is different, which would explain why the U.S. has not moved in the same direction, is an aversion towards redistribution grounded in racism. So if you redistribute to people who don't look like you, if you cannot mentally see, there but for the grace of God go I, then you're less likely to favor social democracy.
Yes, well, in fact, the United States is different in many other ways. And there is a long-standing historical discussion about why there's no socialism in the United States. But what you say, nevertheless, has a kernel of truth, and goes especially to the question of tolerance to foreigners and social cohesion. So under conventional social democracy, under historical social democracy, the basis of social solidarity, the social cement, is money transfers organized by the state against the background of a high level of homogeneity, the point that you were making, cultural and social homogeneity. When the level of homogeneity is degraded, for example, by migratory flows, by migration in Europe, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. So it appeared to be sufficient when there was a high level of homogeneity, but it is revealed as insufficient when there isn't. That's the particular in which it becomes most pertinent. It's often said that a test of social solidarity is the willingness of people to sacrifice for other people's children. And that obviously comes up in the situation that you describe, and we're going to discuss it. But that's what it goes to. I don't think that the events in the United States can be explained that way. There's a long history of this. And probably the most powerful factor is one that we discussed when we discussed last week, the United States, which is the part of the United States that was not slave, the free part, the North, was a petty bourgeois economy. It was an economy in which, as I pointed out, almost everyone who was not a slave in the North was self-employed. Wage labor was an anomaly. And contrary to Tocqueville's idea that the Americans were obsessed with equality, in fact, they were obsessed with a particular vision of freedom, which is this freedom of the artisan, the small-scale producer, the tradesperson. That economy was like the slave economy of the South. That economy was destroyed by the Civil War and in the aftermath of the Civil War. But the influence of this vision of agency and freedom was never dimmed. Any more comments? Now, what then happened to social democracy? The second part of my argument. It was attacked on two grounds. It was attacked as costly, inefficient, rigid. It was attacked as unfair. All these arrangements that orchestrated a compromise between big business and organized labor, the social contracts, or incomes policies, as they were also called, or that defended the little against the small, or the stable against the unstable in the labor and corporate markets, were seen by their critics and enemies as burdens on market efficiency. And as a bias in favor of the insiders or incumbents against the outsiders or challengers. So the labor markets under historical social democracy always had outsiders in greater or lesser proportion. There was always some measure of precarious workers, of workers in unstable employment, the so-called secondary part of the labor market. And they were prejudiced. The market in corporate control imposed much greater hurdles than it imposes in the United States to takeovers of different kinds, and created a bias in favor of the corporate insiders, and so forth. So historical social democracy became the victim of a double attack: as unfair and as inefficient or costly. But that wasn't the decisive factor in its thinning down. The decisive factor was the transformation in the mode of production, in the form of production, and in the character of the productive vanguard of the economy. Up through the 19th century, the productive vanguard had been Fordist mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes and highly specialized and hierarchical relations of production. And as we've already seen, that productive vanguard all over the world is in trouble and decline to a greater or lesser extent. Two European countries, Germany and Switzerland, maintain very important manufacturing sectors. But industrial manufacture all over the world has lost its primacy. And the decline or disintegration of industrial manufacture was a subversion of a whole social world. The world of the big corporate entity, the world of the big factory, the world of unions and stable employment, and the world of the working class communities that lived under this regime. So that was the essential force. That, rather than the normative criticism, which, to my mind, explains the transformation of this social reality. A new vanguard emerged, the insular knowledge economy, the knowledge economy in enclaves that exclude the vast majority of workers and of businesses. And in that new reality of the knowledge economy and the insular knowledge economy, the very distinction between sectors became less clear. So in the age of the insular knowledge economy, services, the main source of jobs in any contemporary economy, cannot be clearly distinguished often from advanced manufacture. Advanced manufacture consists in crystallized and combined intellectual services, and many of the major businesses are fabless. They have no physical apparatus. They outsource their production. So under the pressure of this subversion of the world of industrial mass production, as well as the impact of the ideological criticism of social democracy being both costly and unjust, what happened to social democracy? What happened to social democracy is that it retreated. It gave up some of itself in order to retain what its leaders regarded as essential. And in particular, referring back to my second definition of social democracy, it gave up the first two sets of arrangements that had historically defined it in order to maintain the third. It gave up the defense, little by little, it began to give up the defense of incumbents against outsiders. Incumbents in the labor markets, stable workers against unstable workers, and incumbents in the corporate markets. Corporate incumbents against challengers in the market of corporate control. And it gave up then the second set of arrangements, the incomes policies or social contracts by which the state organized a deal between big business and organized labor about the distribution of the costs and benefits of different macroeconomic growth paths. And this social democracy that results from the abdication of the first two sets of arrangements was achieved in order to preserve the third, because the third is what was regarded as essential. The third set of arrangements was the preservation of a high level of entitlements, serving as instruments for investment in people and their capabilities. Paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. That's what was regarded as essential. Socially, economically, and politically, because the preservation of this high level of budgetary commitment in favor of entitlements that represented social investment was the basis of power in Europe. So the social democracy that resulted from this thinning down operation, this abdication of the secondary attributes or characteristics of social democracy, is what we can call social liberalism. And social liberalism inherits the mantle of social democracy as the beneficiary of ideological admiration and imitation throughout the world. It is the default position of the progressives worldwide. Now let me describe one characteristic initiative of social democracy in the age of social liberalism, and then attempt to explore and generalize its significance as a testimonial to the nature of social liberalism, but also as a read into the whole situation. It is a system that can sometimes call flex security, identified with the Netherlands and then Sweden and with the Scandinavian countries in general. So under the system of flex security, the basic endowments and entitlements of the worker and citizen are vested in him rather than dependent on the job. And they are portable. So this was seen as the solution to a problem. The solution was preserving for the individual worker and citizen safeguards against economic insecurity, but reconciling these safeguards with market flexibility. So the individual, for example, could be fired, but he would have his guarantee. There wouldn't be an attempt to establish a fix, a freeze on the situation of the business or of the sector. There could be this flexibility, and flexibility combined with protection against insecurity, what everyone wants. Now, implicit in this rather homely arrangement was a very large idea of the nature of basic rights. And that's what I want to speak to now as being part of the unresolved or unaccomplished content of this transformation of social democracy and its translation into social liberalism. And to explain the nature of this transformation, let me make an analogy to the relation of a parent to a child. The parent says to the child, "You have an unconditional place in my love. Now, go out into the world and raise a storm. Go raise a storm of creation, of innovation, of experiment, secure as you are in my love." That, you could say, is the nature of fundamental rights. That's what a fundamental right is for. It secures the individual in a haven of vital protected interests so that he can deliver himself to the storm. That would be the ideal. Now, of course, in practice, in its economic use, as in this device of flex security that I just described, serves a much more limited function. It doesn't have this high ambition that I just attributed to it. But it is a device which should not be diminished and seen as merely a practical detail, because built into it, there is the potential for a very large normative aspiration. So far, so good? Any comments about this? So social democracy, described unsentimentally, realistically, on the basis of 3 sets of arrangements. It gives up 2 of the 3. It keeps the 3rd. And it becomes social liberalism, a liberalized, thinned down form of social democracy, which is what results from this historical transmutation. Yes?
Professor, do you think there was a moment where an alternative policy choice to preserve all 3 of the underpinning parts of social democracies might have been taken, particularly in Western
Well, why would you want to preserve all three? I mean, the way you put the question, it sounded like it'd be better to have all three until you were forced to come down to just the one, the third. But why would you want to have the defense of the incumbents against challengers in the labor and corporate markets? Or why would you want to have these macroeconomic deals between big business and organized labor? We have certain practical advantages, but it's basically a heavy favoring of the inside forces. And if you think that the knowledge economy thrives on experimentation, or more generally an innovative economy depends on experimentation, why all this focus on the insiders? Sounds like the 1930s. That's what prevailed in the 1930s, the restabilization of the economy. Here the idea was we want only stability in the form and to the degree compatible with maximal growth and innovation. And if you want that, then you wouldn't want to have all three. Now, this is not an argument that the result, social liberalism in its contemporary form, is sufficient. But it is a reason why you can see that historical social democracy would have few friends, because its natural friends were the insiders, the union leaders, the representatives of the major organized force of labor, the corporate insiders who were held these crisscrossing stakes in one another's enterprises, the banks that were connected to the industrialists, and so forth. In other words, it was a coterie, was a clique of insiders, of asset holders, with legal protections against all who would subvert their control. So why defend them? Aside from the fact that they naturally would want to defend themselves, they were overwhelmed. So now I come to the third part of my argument, which is the future then. What are the problems that social liberalism doesn't solve? And this has a large meaning for the world, because if social liberalism is now the default position of the progressives, to describe its limits is to describe the limits of the world ideological situation. So although what I'm now going to say is especially adapted to the European situation, it has application to the whole world and the whole world ideological debate. So let's begin with two problems that are at the limit between the problems that are already dealt with and the problems that are not yet dealt with. So they're, as it were, the limit problems. The first regards the provision of public services, which, after all, is a major topic of electoral contest in every democracy in the world. How are public services provided? With what quality, with what guarantees, with what level of funding? And now I'm going to state a proposition about what I'm considering the limit, the place where action is now in the most advanced states of the world. What generally exists in the world by way of provision of public services is what you could call administrative Fordism. Remember, Fordism as in Fordist mass production. The administrative counterpart to Fordism is the provision of low-quality, standardized services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And to say that they're low quality simply means that they're of lower quality than the comparable services that could be bought on the market by someone with money. That's what it means. And that's the basic way of providing services. So there's a knowledge economy, there's experimental innovation in production, but in administration, and especially in the administration of public services, for the most part, there's none of that. And what then is the alternative? Other than simply the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms, which the progressives, for good reason, do not want. The alternative is imagining a system with 3 floors. At the bottom floor, the state guarantees a universal minimum of access to public services. And at the top floor, in the development of the most innovative and costly services, the state also operates at the vanguard of the provision of public services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with independent civil society acting through cooperatives not for profit in the experimental and competitive provision of public services by groups of health professionals, educators, and so forth. And then the claim would be the experimental collaboration of independently organized civil society with the apparatus of the state in the provision of public services is both the most efficient way to enhance the quality of the services and the most powerful inducement to the self-organization of civil society outside the state. So that would be a limiting initiative, an example of what's now at the frontier of public policy under social liberalism. To some extent, adumbrated, anticipated more in some countries than in others. But the general objective is that in the age of the knowledge economy, there should be an administrative counterpart to post-Fordist production. So a post-Fordist style of administration in the provision of public services. Now, the second issue, which is at the limit between what exists and what doesn't yet exist, is the relation of money to the real economy, or finance to production. And there are a series of problems which reveal the inadequacy of the present relation. And let me describe 3 enigmas regarding the relation of finance to production that are all connected and have convergent implications. The first enigma is that it's not clear what all of that liquid capital in the banks and the stock markets is for. Under all the established market economies, production is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. All statistical studies that have been conducted have shown that well over 80% and sometimes over 90% of the funding of production is internally generated in the production system itself. But that observation then generates a disquieting and simple question. What's all that money for in the banks and the stock markets if it's not to finance production? It seems that the vast preponderance of the liquid capital is exhausted in trading of positions with no productive consequence other than to establish theoretically a benchmark of value against which the firms can borrow if they wanted finance. In fact, the prosperous firms have so much capital that they go to the capital markets as speculators and financiers, not as borrowers. That's the first enigma. The second enigma is that finance, which is indifferent to the real economy in good times, becomes destructive and destabilizing in bad times. Financial instability begins in the finance markets and spills over and ends up prejudicing the level of real activity. So there's this asymmetry. You don't need it in good times, but it kills you in bad times. The third enigma is this. The financial activity that would be most important to society, which is the funding of the making of new assets in new ways, which is what we call venture capital, or the associated forms of finance, kindred to it, in fact, occupy a minuscule proportion of financial activity. Even in those countries or economies in which it is most established, which are the United States on a large scale and Israel on a small scale. It's tiny. It's like point something 3%. It's a minuscule amount. So these 3 enigmas that I've just enumerated all point to the same underlying problem, which is the way in which finance capital, rather than serving production, is allowed to serve itself and to develop a parasitic relation to the economy. Now, let me be clear. The problem is not in the speculative element in finance, because financial speculation can be useful in at least 2 ways. in the allocation of risk and in the development of information. The problem is the disassociation of the speculative element of finance from the interests of production. And so the question is, for this second set of initiatives at the frontier of social liberalism, what can we do to tighten the link between finance and production, between finance and the real economy, on the principle that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful, to enlist finance in the service of production rather than allowing it simply to serve itself. So you can see how this is not just a generic problem of finance, but a problem that goes down to the micro level. In the analysis of particular financial products and services. For example, options contracts provided an undoubted service in commodity markets because they guarantee liquidity. But in equity markets, although they were introduced as an antidote to gambling, they were then converted into devices of gambling, which they now largely are. So then there's a whole debate. What legal instruments can we have that discourage the merely speculative use of these financial products and encourage the conversion of liquid capital into production, especially in that most important activity of funding the making of new assets in new ways. And of course, together with these negative initiatives, would go initiatives to tap the dormant productive potential of, for example, the saving caught in the pension systems of the world, in the public and private pension systems, and put them in diversified portfolios or funds that invested in new production in such a way that the risk would be contained in the way in which risk is always contained, by diversification. But this is not just a technical discussion of finance or of capital, because the influence of finance on the whole character of the economy and society can be profound. The larger, more fundamental question is whether this parasitic element of finance can be mastered and converted into something more useful. So those are the two paramount questions that, as I say, stand at the frontier between the established agenda of social liberalism and the next agenda. And now let me describe three issues that are entirely beyond the limits of the present agenda, but that are fundamental. The first is the character of democracy. The basic temper of historical experience in Europe in the 20th century was there is transformation when there is war. When there is war, the Europeans wake up, or they are woken up, and great changes take place. When universal peace is reestablished, the Europeans go back to sleep and drown their sorrows in consumption. And the question is whether there can be transformation without trauma. This is what we would want. But for there to be transformation without trauma, the democracies have to be organized in order to expose themselves to trouble, rather than in order to do what the American Constitution does, which is to inhibit the transformation of society by politics. Now, the first requirement for this high-energy democracy is then the elevation of the temperature, as I argued about the United States. Because only a high-temperature politics can be a politics with rich structural content. And it's not true. Yes, I'll come to you.
Can you say that?
Yeah. What?
Can you just say that last piece one more
Yes. Only a high-energy politics, a high-temperature or high-energy politics, can be a politics with rich structural content. So going back to my provocation of a week ago or 2 weeks ago, the premise of conservative statecraft and conservative political science is that a democracy must be either cold and institutional, as Madison's democracy was, or it must be hot and anti-institutional. Anti or extra institutional, some form of Caesarism or populism. So in other words, the premise of conservative political science or conservative statecraft is that at the end of the day you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. And this premise, I want to argue, is false. It's not true. We can have democracies that are both hot and institutional, depending on the range of institutions that we choose. And the focus now, in the European context and coming out of the transformation of social democracy into social liberalism, the focus is the politics of innovation, of economic innovation and of social innovation, and of experimentalism, of being able to try something out before committing to it universally or permanently. So, a high temperature politics. Second, an acceleration of the pace of politics, so we don't maintain impasses. Now, of course, most of the European countries are pure parliamentary systems of one kind or another, so they shouldn't have impasses. But they do in a highly divided class society in which parts of the state have privileged relations with parts of the political class. And so we should proceed as if they had the same problem, because the solutions are similar. And the third set of innovations would be innovations that combine a facility for decisive central action with the ability of part of the country to secede from the dominant solutions and generate a counter model of the national future. Because the most powerful dialectic in the political life of the people is not a contest of abstractions, but of examples. That's what matters. And so a simple way to think of this is in relation to federal systems. Because in a federal system, the question of the deviation of the local is posed naturally. But it's a mistake to think that this doesn't apply to unitary states. It does apply to unitary states like the United Kingdom or France. In fact, unitary states have an advantage in this respect over federal systems. Because in a unitary state, there is no default presumption that all parts of the country must simultaneously enjoy the same latitude of deviation. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, England may make a deal with Scotland different from the deal it makes with Wales or with different parts of England itself. So this experimentalism within the country applies regardless of it being a federal system or a unitary state. Now, in relation to this problem that I've just described, a high-energy democracy achieved through this combination of strong central action with strong deviations depending on the way in which shared, concurrent, and divided powers are shared within the country. You have overlapping jurisdiction with respect to this, you don't have it with respect to that. So you can combine concurrence and division. Let me introduce a fourth element, obviously pertinent to Europe, which is the European Union. The European Union is being developed on the architectural principle that the norms defining the basic forms of economic and social organization are unified, de jure in Brussels and de facto in Berlin. And the norms defining the social, economic, and educational endowments of the citizens are delegated to the national and subnational authorities. That's the system on which the European Union has developed. It should be exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. That should be turned upside down on this model that I'm proposing to you. The vocation of the Union is to define and defend the vocation, the equipment of all of its citizens, but then to give the national and subnational authorities the greatest latitude for institutional experimentation. And who is most interested in that happening? Those who are most interested in Europe are the Eastern European states and the Southern European states and the oppositional forces within Germany and France. So those forming a political coalition would have to force the redirection of the Union. That's the only way in which it could happen. It couldn't happen spontaneously because it's completely against the prevailing logic of the Union. And this logic in which the power to reshape the arrangements is held at the center, and then the local authorities give the equipment, as it were, explains the situation in Europe, the spiritual situation. Everyone who is very young or very old or romantic or ambitious is against the Union. And the Union lies in the stranglehold of dead centrist technocracy. And this is death. This is the death of a political project. It has to live. And its living has to have political consequence, political instruments. So a high energy politics in both the member states and in the European Union is the first requirement for what should come or could come after social liberalism. The second requirement is an inclusive form of the new vanguardism, the knowledge economy. If there's one place in the world which is suited to be the host, the basis of an inclusive knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many, it's Europe. Many of the European economies were characterized by pre-industrial traditions of craft production. We know that knowledge economy production unites in itself characteristics of mass production and of craft production. The artisanal techniques of craft production at a scaled up level. And that helps explain why in Europe, many of the regions that have been most successful in the development of experimental innovation knowledge economies, like Emilia-Romagna in Italy, Baden-Württemberg in Germany, Catalonia in Spain, are regions that were characterized by rich traditions of pre-industrial craft production. And of course, that has all sorts of implications. Educational implications, for example. What kind of practical vocational training after the traditional German model of apprenticeship training is appropriate in the age of the knowledge economy? Obviously, it has to be a form of education focused on the higher order, flexible, conceptual, and manual capabilities required by the use of numerically controlled machine tools. It requires dense social capital, because we know that the knowledge economy flourishes in settings of cooperative competition with a fluid mixture of cooperation and competition in all domains, and that it allows and requires a higher level of trust from all of its participants. And all of that is likely to flourish only against the background of more social capital. And then finally, the institutional innovations and legal innovations that a knowledge economy for the many would require. For example, in the regime of intellectual property, but ultimately in the general regime of property. So that there can be a radical democratization of access to capital, of productive capital. A knowledge economy for the many is the second project, together with a high energy democracy, as in the United States. The third project is a kind of education that is focused on criticism and innovation. So we know this is not what prevails now in Europe. Even in the most successful examples of educational policy. So, for example, the small European country that has been most successful in education is Finland. But how does Finland do it? Finland does it by focusing its attention and investment on the performance of the lowest quintile of each class in the comparative tests. And that, of course, is not adequate. I need a completely different kind of education. And I, before, began to describe some of the attributes of this kind of education. It should be focused on the acquisition of analytic and synthetic capabilities. It should develop mastery of these capabilities by dealing with content, because you have to deal with content. You can't just develop the capabilities in a vacuum. But with respect to content, what matters is selective depth, not encyclopedic superficiality. In other words, a style of education oriented by themes and projects. Third, its social basis should be cooperative. Teamwork among teachers, among schools, among students. Fourth, it should generalize the principle of classical education. Everyone should be exposed to the ideas and experience of a society and a culture remote from his own. But preferably standing in some kind of relation to it, as we stood to the Greeks and Romans, and the Chinese stood to the Confucianist canon. And fifth, and most significantly, all education should be dialectical and taught from opposing points of view. Nothing should be taught just once, everything should be taught at least twice. And this is the only way to liberate the mind. So, high energy democracy, knowledge economy for the many, analytical and dialectical education, and the self-organization of society, accelerated, stimulated through the alternative way of providing public services that I described. And perhaps some form of mandatory national service, social service, as an alternative to military service. Everyone should serve. Everyone should serve his or her country, preferably in some part of the country different from where he comes from. And everyone should have an experience of social solidarity and devotion to the building of the country. Now that's quite a lot there. There's an ambitious program. Let me stop and ask whether you'd like to make any comments. So I'm providing this, I'm proposing this program at a remove, of course, from Europe, and in a form which is designed to accentuate the interest that humanity can take in it. So now the orthodoxy shines from Europe, the social liberal orthodoxy, and it's presented to us in a tame, relatively conservative form. I'm trying to present it in another form, in which it signals the direction of transformation, not simply the preservation of a legacy. Comments? Yes.
When I picture your program and ideas in terms of like federalism and devolving powers to local governments, in the European context, I think of Germany, which has some of the most devolved powers and strongest state governments of any federal system. And yet there we're also seeing some like malaise and dissatisfaction with social democracy, especially in the former East. So I guess, you know, is what Germany has done with devolving powers to its state governments enough? Should we go further? What's your, I guess, ideas in terms of that?
Yes, but you have to see the historical context of the trouble in Germany, right? So German unification was a tremendous opportunity to rebuild Germany. And the idea was, we won't just rebuild the East, we'll rebuild the West. We'll create a different country. That's the ambitious project. And it was the opposite that happened at many different levels. As the population of East Germany had the sense that they were being treated the way the Americans treat Puerto Rico. They came in and they said, now we're going to sell off your jobs, your industries. In the Treuhand Gesellschaft in Berlin, the East Germans didn't even have any participation. Well, I'm just speaking straightforwardly what I think and what I saw, but that's the explanation. So I think, but the broader point you make is that this experience of heating up of politics, creation of alternatives, is dangerous. You're right to think it's dangerous. But then there's, what's the alternative? Is the alternative to politicize the people, to educate them in politics more and more, or to bring down the temperature? And of course, implied in this argument I'm making is a gamble. That the civic education through engagement and experimentation is superior to the cooling down. But it's a very consequential decision. So it'd be natural to have qualms. Well, let me just take a few more minutes now at the outset and make a final remark about something that's in the background of this whole argument. And relates to this question of bigness and littleness. So, as you may remember, one interpretation of what it means to be a progressive or a leftist is you think we can all become bigger, provided that we all become bigger together. That's one criterion. And the other criterion is we change the structure. In reality, we almost always change it piece by piece, little by little. We don't change it the way that Karl Marx imagined, in some one big system. But we do change it, and that's the way in which we change it. Now, in Europe, in the 20th century, there were three great sons of ardor, fervor, that lifted people up from the long littleness of life. Life is about greater things. These were, the three were Christianity, the nation, and war, the second one. And the third were the great ideologies and ideological crusades of the 20th century. Liberalism, socialism, communism, Bolshevism. There's a procession of banners, and under these banners people fought and died. Now it's all the opposite. They don't fight and die, for the most part, under any of these banners. They don't believe in these banners. And life becomes little. This is the real poison. This is the real problem. So I think that's actually the most difficult and the most interesting aspect of the problem I'm addressing through European social democracy. Because there's all this stuff in it. Like my argument had 18 parts or something, but in the end the 18 parts don't count, right? What counts is the fire behind it. And what's our attitude to it or to its missing? And can you reignite the fire without participating in this collective illusion? Yes.
Thank you very much for the review, which is hard to disagree with. However, I think one force is perhaps a bigger threat to European social democracy right now than the change in the means of production, and it is immigration and its integration. And I'm not saying it in the sense that people will come and fundamentally alter the character of European nations, but I'm saying European politicians have not found a way to address it that prevents the countries from going into a tailspin. So I think, proportionally quite small flows of people that have engineered or sort of have fueled right-wing parties across Europe. I think it was instrumental in the Brexit vote. Right now we're looking at a sort of almost avowedly fascist party in Germany polling at around 20%. And so I think that's actually the biggest threat to the democratic part of European social democracy right now. In Denmark, it's been a problem we've been grappling with for the last 30 years politically. And the only sort of solution that have allowed us to maintain some of our social democratic tradition is that all the parties sort of unanimously adopt a very, very strict attitudes towards immigration and towards immigrants. But I see the same sort of dynamic playing out in other European countries, and I'm not sure that the outcome will necessarily be one that preserves our democracy.
Like in Germany, for example.
Like in Germany,
Yes.
or in France.
Yes. Well, yes, and so,
And so I think in an account of the threats to social democracy, how it absorbs people of different backgrounds, I think is necessary. And I think it's perhaps its inability to do so productively is perhaps as big of a sort of
Yes. And
Well, I was hoping to state it a little bit provocatively so you could either agree or disagree.
no, but you weren't that provocative, really. You said something that most of us would agree with. The question is what we should do. So I think that, in fact, there's little we can do that's not long-term, right? Because let's go back to the basics. Take a country like Sweden. So it's basically a country of peasants who had an empire and grew rich. And when they all looked like one another, it's like a big peasant tribe, right? And then they had this deal among themselves, and that worked well. And now it's not like that. It's different from that. So I think that in the long term, the basis of social solidarity in the long term cannot be homogeneity. It cannot be that we look the same and that we are the same. I think the stronger basis of solidarity is doing things together. That's the true basis of solidarity. No matter where we come from, what we were ancestrally, it is purposive collaboration to a higher end, which should be the great unifier. And so the generic prescription, which won't help you very much in detail, but is a direction, is that organize people to do things together. For example, in this provision of public services, in the education, in the national service, and that begins to produce a different form of solidarity. That's not a solution to the short-term thing. That there'll be the reaction, a nativist reaction by the local population, but it's the creation of a different kind of nation. And that's, I think, the direction, that's the choice we have to make. We have to combine that long-term with a series of prudential moves to secure the democracy in the short term, and expressions of restraint to avoid dangerous political flirtations. So it seems to me that's the general character of the direction. What do you think?
I agree that I think there needs to be a sort of revision and a retelling of our national histories. Where you're born actually matters, and you participate in a project. I think sort of saying that symbols don't matter, like the flag doesn't matter, borders don't matter, and so on, rub a lot of people the wrong way. I think there needs to be sort of productive patriotism. I agree with you that the EU should go from, it's a little bit analogous to sort of the flex security in a single country, right? So you need to have fundamental security so that you can experiment.
Yes, exactly.
And the EU should provide the same. Okay, so we have customs unions, we don't get bullied on trade, but other than sort of these de minimis things, countries should experiment and productively so to find models that work. And right now, I
Yes.
agree that the emphasis
Yes.
is in a different direction. But I don't have the solution to why our democracies go into a tailspin and throw our democratic principles overboard because of a relatively small arrival of people who are of different creed or who look different.
Well, the smallness is relative to what existed before, right? So if you were a unified village and suddenly the stranger appears at the door, it can be frightening. And I think it is true that the same general principle of the haven in the storm applies, right? I think this is that the individual has to feel secure in this haven, so that he can experiment, so that he can go out, and that's the basic aspiration. And of course, it's difficult and it's dangerous. But I also think that in this process, there should be a transformation of the nature of solidarity. Solidarity should depend less and less on sameness and more on interdependence and collaboration. And that's just higher. It's a higher level of ambition. It's not something that we come to naturally in the world, but we can come to it. And when we do come to it, we are rewarded. The European countries are the countries in the world which are best placed to be the scouts and vanguards of humanity in this operation. It was always said by the defenders of the European Union that the European Union was a model for globalization. But I don't think it's a model for globalization as it has become, because all the forces that are alive resist the European Union. Yes.
In the class, we've taken kind of implicit and explicit stances against Marxist ideology or verbiage, and said that it's kind of dead. And in today's
No,
class,
I think more. I think a great part of the theoretical system is unbelievable. And I think, and by the way, there is no one in the world who is a more passionate admirer of Karl Marx than me. I'm a huge admirer of Karl Marx as a person, as a thinker, as everything. But the particular system that he developed it can't be the solution. So what we have this situation now in which the left had a guide. The guide was Marxism. All the particular propositions of Marxism, the systemic propositions are false. There's a closed list of regimes, the modes of production. Each of these regimes is indivisible, and they're lost. It's all false. That stuff is all false. The problem is that people continue to use the vocabulary, the words, outside of the context that gave the meaning. So it's a kind of self-deception on a massive scale. And that's the problem. What we should have done, what we should yet do, is the opposite of this. Instead of taking the central revolutionary insight that the structures of society are made, and we made them, and therefore we can understand them, and liberating it from all of that false science, radicalizing it. That's what we should have done, and we did the opposite. We preserved it in its carapace, in its mummy, in order to continue using the words for our convenience, as if they had the meaning that they used to have. And that's then creating this huge confusion in the world. So I think the most obvious point of the confusion is what I call the binary idea of politics. It's either you reform or you revolutionize, right? So the world is full of these people now governing the states of the world who were ex-Marxists. And the way they think is, a fundamental change would be a revolution, be the change of everything. We're not going to do that. That's too dangerous. So we'll humanize. And then we have the sugar-coaters who then appear on the scene, and who can be also careerists conveniently for them. So in this situation, the elements of self-deception, equivocation, are mixed up indissolubly with self-interest and abdication, compromise, false compromise, unnecessary compromise. So what can you do? That's the situation. The
Yeah,
moon.
I think I agree with you that the terms are kind of diluted now to a point of almost being useless, but I do wonder, you know, in today's lecture you mentioned moving, and maybe maybe it's uncharitable, but this kind of inevitable evolution away from the modes of production into this insular knowledge economy. You've argued for a more inclusive knowledge economy. But I just wonder if that's an accurate picture, because the production is still going on, it's just not in our faces anymore. And in the countries where the international corporations that run the production are running their operations, we have the power to kind of help them help the workers of the world. So, like, I don't know, in like Bangladesh, if they would agree with you that like production is going away and there's this insular knowledge economy that's taking over the world.
Well, but it's not meant to be a deterministic apparatus that describes how some evolution is automatically happening. That's not the spirit of it. I think that one of the many profound insights that Karl Marx tapped into was this idea that I've tried to refer to as the alternative to the path of least resistance. So there's some set of innovations in the world, like the innovations associated with the knowledge economy. And the natural tendency in the world is that those innovations are going to be established in the form that is least subversive of the ruling interests and the established ideas. The insular knowledge economy that we have now in the world is a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. So it takes the knowledge economy, it cuts it down to size, and it fits it into the world. So that's the world in which there doesn't have to be an incineration of the class system. There doesn't have to be this, there doesn't have to be that. So it fits the innovation, it makes the innovation fit us, right? So a Spanish philosopher, Miguel de Unamuno, said, in the world, the victorious are those who adapt to the world. The defeated are those who demand that the world adapt to them. And so then Unamuno adds, and therefore, the whole advance of humanity rests on the shoulders of the defeated. So that's related to this. So what the insight that Karl Marx tapped into was that the tendency is for the innovations to be defeated, to be compressed, diminished. And the defenders of the path of least resistance, of this minimalist version, always have the advantage. They have the world on their side, the established world. But they have a disadvantage, which is that their version, their diminished version of the innovation skimps on the potential of the innovation. That there's a tremendous potential which is not exhausted in that conventional version. So then the opponent of the path of least resistance can come along as, but now I'm going to present a much more radical version of that. And it's going to make you powerful and richer and wiser and so forth. And that doesn't depend on any simple determinism, on any contraption that history is a machine providing the sequence of victors. But it does show how there are these contradictions, and that resistance can have its rewards at a spectacular level. And I think that's what has to animate us in these projects. But And I think that another problem that we have in the programmatic arguments is the mendacious character of the inherited ideological vocabulary. So we've been dealing with Europe, and European politics is filled with the pretentious vocabularies of 200 years of all these ideological crusades, which the Europeans now themselves don't believe in. So they're also using these words that came from this other epoch, which have these worn-out meanings. But I think it's better that there are those words than that they're not them, because they're mementos, reminders of a past greatness. And I always think that the central idea in politics is the idea of greatness. And then the question becomes who will participate in it, how will it look, and so forth. Because otherwise it's just a long littleness. I think that's enough for today. It's a fantastic discussion, and it couldn't be more important or less wanted in the world than it is now. It's just a reason to do it. Thank you.